I think we need to think about the role of civil society and social movements within countries in Europe, as well as regional and kind of, more global movements. Because the reality is, if we're talking about defending democracy, building resistance, building voices for change, then we really have to think about local leaders and the ways in which to strengthen the infrastructure for civil society in many countries where civil society is currently under attack. If we think of Hungary, if we think of Russia, and it's not just human rights groups. Of course, human rights groups are greatly at risk, but it's a broad swath of civil society institutions, including academic organizations. And so I think that is really, really important as we think about responses to have long-term capacity building for ensuring democracy.
Hello, and a hearty welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, Executive Director of Cambridge Forum, and we have an ample agenda for you today. Could there be a more apt time to grapple with the topic of, can we resist the hijacking in democracy in America and beyond? In the past decade, we have witnessed the gradual and steady erosion of democratic values, a growing lack of respect for democratic institutions and process, both within the United States and beyond. Has there been a more divided period in the world since the Cold War? Hate crimes abound, lies deliberately stoke division between right and left, even in countries that host a plethora of voting options like France. An unprecedented attack on the US Capitol last January unnerved the nation as images of insurrection whizzed around the world, challenging America's image as the enduring symbol of freedom, equality, and justice. In February 22, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, on the pretext of saving an independent nation from the invented threat of Nazism, brought a bizarre combination of might and misinformation to a peak. Fast forward to today, and the Supreme Court's decision to reverse Roe versus Wade. Well, to help us make sense of the political quagmire in which we find ourselves, we have a meeting of three great minds today. John Shattuck and Shushma Rahman are co-authors of a new book, Holding Together: Why Our Rights Are Under Siege and How to Reclaim Them for Everyone. John Shattuck is the Fletcher School Professor of Diplomacy at Tufts and a senior fellow at Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. The first US official to interview survivors of the genocide at Srebrenica, he helped negotiate the Dayton peace agreement that ended the war in Bosnia, and was instrumental in the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. He served also as US ambassador to the Czech Republic in the Clinton administration. Shushma Rahman is Executive Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard and host of the Justice Matters podcast, as well as a contributor for Foreign Policy magazine. She has 2 decades of experience in launching and leading social justice and human rights initiatives. And thirdly, our moderator today will be Arkon Fung, Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. So welcome to all three of you. And now I'm going to hand over to Arkon.
Thank you very much, Mary, and to the staff and audience, to the audience of the Cambridge Forum. It's delightful to be able to join you in this conversation today about democracy and human rights. Let's start with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which occurred began a little more than 2 months ago. John, what do you think is at stake for democracy and human rights in Ukraine, but also in Europe and well beyond in this invasion and how it plays out?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Arkon, and thank you, Mary, and my thanks as well to the staff for putting this together. This is a momentous time for human rights. I don't think there's any need to elaborate on that point. But I think what, in a sense, we don't look at enough is the origins of some of the crises that we face in the authoritarian violence, and that is very much what we see in the model that Putin is using to basically undermine and completely destroy, if he could, the very identity and national existence of the people of Ukraine. And of course, war is the ultimate instrument of coercion. And to use war to destroy democracy is a model that is, thanks to Putin, is very much alive and well. Not well, perhaps, but certainly alive in the world today. It's certainly a wake-up call for rather complacent Western democracies that I think have gotten used to the long period of peace. And the Ukrainians are showing that democracy is worth fighting for. I think what's at stake are a number of things. Above all, the rule of force, which Putin wants to impose on the world, versus the rule of law, which we are rather used to. And there's a quote by Thucydides, which I think says it all. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. That's effectively what the rule of force is all about. Sovereignty and national borders are very much at stake. This is a global threat. It's not simply a threat to democratic countries, the militarization of international relations, and above all, massive human rights crimes, and in this case, the crime of genocide, which is the destruction of the Ukrainian, or the attempted destruction of the Ukrainian national and cultural identity, which is really what Putin's stated aim is. Now, that's one model. There are two others that I'll just put forward very briefly. The second model, which is of an attack on democracy in Europe, is really championed by Viktor Orban, who is the leading proponent and practitioner of what I would call the nonviolent hijacking of democracy and human rights. He's used a series of elections to take power and to hollow out and take over democratic institutions. He's become a model for other right-wing populist leaders who are trying to do the same thing. He's basically taken over the legislative, judicial, media, education, economic, financial, cultural, all the various institutions that go into making up pluralistic democracies. And he's done so by using what I would call the politics of fear. Outsiders, migrants. He's attacked migrants and refugees for a long time, although he's accepting refugees now from Ukraine who happen to have Hungarian backgrounds. And this has been very influential in other countries, in Poland, in France, where Marine Le Pen has taken heart from the victories of Viktor Orban, in Serbia, in Slovenia and Italy, and also in the US, where Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson, as I think we've seen recently, have cited frequently Orban as a model of the kind of attack on democracy and human rights that and the autocratic rule that he represents. Now, Putin has set back the Orban model slightly because Putin is a strong supporter, and Orban was very close to Putin. And so what we've seen recently is the defeat of Marine Le Pen in France, the defeat of an Orban style prime minister in Slovenia, and the EU and UN, NATO rather, unity that's been shown in response to the attack on Ukraine. So that's the second model. The third model, which we'll discuss in a moment, is what I would call the insurrectionist model. And this is the model that we have, as Mary said in her opening, that's very much in play in the US today. It's championed, of course, by Trump, and it involves both nonviolence and, to some degree, violence, as we saw in the attack on the Capitol. And I'll save further comments on that until we come back to the US. So that's my overview.
That's great, John. Thank you very much. Let me follow up just a little bit. How much do you think that this being the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, end up being a wake-up call? Because immediately prior to the invasion, or for several years prior to the invasion, you might think Europe and the United States had gotten a little bit sleepy with regard to democracy. Germany itself seemed very comfortable with all sorts of relationships with Russia, and the nature of the non-democratic nature of that regime, I think, was no secret for anyone. We see the rise, as you point out rightly, of at least illiberal democracies, maybe even not democracies at all, in Hungary, and then populist, democratically questionable movements in France and Poland and many other places. And you might think that one of the conditions that makes this possible is we've maybe forgotten a little bit the value of liberal democracy, and to the extent that there can be any silver lining in a tragedy and a war as horrible as the invasion of Ukraine is, and it is very horrible, perhaps it is a wake-up call. But do you think it will end up being that? And how can we make it more that, so that we remember the value of democracy that has been a little bit hard for some of us to remember, I think, since the end of the Cold War?
Well, I think we don't have to go any further than to look at the heroic behavior and leadership of the Ukrainians on this subject. They have shown, indeed, that this wake-up call is necessary. Otherwise, if we all go to sleep, certainly the rather silent and insidious development of the Orban style the hijacking of democracy can occur, even if there's no direct attack from somebody like Putin. And I think what we've seen very specifically in the US recently is that it's maybe not perfect, but we've seen a development of some degree of bipartisan consensus that this is a fight for democracy and for the protection of the sovereignty and the human rights of the people of Ukraine, that a very polarized country like the United States can agree on. And the same has been true across Europe. We've certainly seen in the elections in France, as I said, and also in Slovenia, but also in the in the new interest that Sweden and Finland are showing in joining the NATO alliance. And all of that, I think, is a stirring of interest in democratic values. It certainly, the complacency that we felt as a result, I think, of the long period of peace, and also a high degree of willingness to just be interested in material goods and well-being, all of that cut against democratic interests. So we'll see how far this goes.
Good. And I want to put a question on the table that I won't that we'll answer in a little bit, but this one is for everyone in the audience to ponder. And I raise it because I've been pondering it myself. I was at a meeting in which many people were talking about the state of American democracy, and a journalist from Texas said, well, I came to the meeting to try to understand how to explain the importance of American democracy to Jane and Joe at Stop and Shop, who seemed to care more about inflation and gas prices and the employment and economic situation. And indeed, it feels like the capitally Democratic Party leadership has tilted a little bit away from thinking about and focusing on democracy issues to more the kitchen table issues. And so that led me to a thought experiment, which I want to pose to the panel and to the audience, and we'll revisit in a few minutes. But the thought experiment is this, how do you explain, imagine that January 6th, that the insurrection had been successful. And right now, when we're doing this discussion on the Cambridge Forum, Donald J. Trump is president. I think that actually not that much would be materially different in the lives of Jane and Joe at Stop and Shop on this Tuesday evening. So I'm asking you how you would explain to Jane and Joe at Stop and Shop why they should care that the 2020 election on this hypothetical wasn't successful, that the person who didn't get the most electoral college votes ends up being president. Why should they care, as opposed to the price of gas or the lack of jobs or their inability to get healthcare and childcare? So let me put that, we'll revisit that when we talk about American democracy in the second part of the segment. But so think about that question. I want to raise immigration and the refugee crisis that has been occasioned. We've been in a series of refugee crises at least since the beginning of the Forever Wars. But there's a new burst, obviously, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The invasion has displaced some 11 million Ukrainians so far, most of them internal, but 5 million have fled to other countries. And Sushma and John, as you point out in your book, one of the central responsibilities of other countries is to assure that the human rights of these refugees are respected and protected. Sushma, how do you think we, broadly speaking, the countries of Europe and North America, are doing in regard with this latest incredible refugee crisis?
Thank you, Arkan, and thank you, Mary and colleagues, for including me in this very vital conversation. So Arkan, as you mentioned, 11 million people have been displaced, at least 11 million people, and we will anticipate that many more will be displaced in the weeks and months to come. I'll flag that initially, as we think about displacement, we should also think about people who are internally displaced, who often may be invisible, undercounted, and not always available, able to seek international protection. So that is something to bear in mind as well. In terms of people who've been displaced within other countries, you know, there is a notion that somehow the West has often had to bear the burden of refugees, whether we think of people in Syria or, you know, other countries. But the reality is most refugees who are displaced tend to be within the region. They are either displaced within their countries or they are living in the region. And in this situation, we of course see many people being displaced in Poland and other neighboring countries. So the question becomes, what is the role of the United States? And the reality is the refugee program has really been dismantled under the former president and the administration. And while there were definitely ebbs and flows with the program and a need for improvement, it has been decimated. And so this new program to help 100,000 people is really insufficient. And we really need to think of ways to revitalize the entire program, as opposed to helping just a few people who perhaps were already privileged because they had family members here or they have some amount of resources, which would inadvertently affect the most disadvantaged people.
Yeah, the 100,000 number is interesting. When Biden announced that number, I think the leader of Ireland said, yeah, we're taking in 100,000 Ukrainian refugees as well. So it's quite incredible, being a obviously much smaller country. You know, one of the worries that I've heard is that at the same time, the incredible outpouring of support from Poland, from Estonia, from many countries around Ukraine, trying to welcome, in Germany, not least, welcoming refugees at the governmental level, at the civic and community level. Some of the criticisms that I've heard are that, well, that's wonderful, but we saw quite a different reaction when the refugees were coming from Syria and Iraq and the Middle East. Do you think that that's a fair criticism? And how do you reconcile that disparity if you think such a disparity exists?
Well, I think that, you know, our refugee policies often reflect the other kind of policies and values and attitudes. And we see this in the United States as well, with the deep anti-Black bias that exists in the ways in which, for example, Haitians or people from Africa are treated versus people from Cuba, let's say, or folks from Europe. So this really is something that is global. And so, yes, we need to tackle it in our refugee policies, but we also need to tackle it through other mechanisms such as civic education, ensuring racial equity in our domestic laws and policies.
So in a hopeful moment, I pointed the disparity to a friend of mine. I said, well, maybe one of the lasting effects will be the extension of our sympathies, is that we'll look at the recognition of the need of these the extreme need of these Ukrainian refugees. And then in the future, when refugees have a different ethnic or religious background, we'll be more generous. That is, people in Europe and North America, and there will be an extension of universalism. And this person was not as optimistic as I am. He said, no chance. What do you think? Do you think that will be a possibility?
I don't think so. I think that,
oh, no.
well, maybe I should say we're hopeful, because part of the theme of this book and my prior book with Bill Schultz, The Coming Good Society, was more hopeful. But I also look at the arc of migration over the past few decades and the ebbs and flows, and the ways in which perhaps people from Central America are kept in camps while they are waiting processing, or they're held in detention. And of course, the treatment of Haitians on the border has really been horrific in many ways, including sort of sending people back to Haiti, and the treatment of people by Border Patrol. So I do worry that we're not necessarily going to develop greater empathy, but it would be nice to hope for that.
Yeah, very good.
Just a minor comment, but I think looking ahead, we are at the very early stages of what I think is going to be a huge global migration crisis.
Yes.
Contributed to not only by things like the war in Ukraine and all the poverty and violence that people are fleeing to try to come to the United States, but also by climate change and by all of the huge elements of global insecurity that we see. And so I would say of all the future human rights problems, this is going to be near the top of the list. And I think countries are going to have to come together in a much more effective way than they have. We need new refugee law. We need a much better understanding among countries about how to allocate responsibilities. And all of that, of course, is politically difficult. And therefore, I'm not optimistic that this can be done overnight. But I think you're right to point to this as one of the biggest issues that we're facing in the future in the human rights dimension.
Yeah, I completely agree with John. More people are on the move today than at any time since the Second World War. And the reasons for movement are far more complicated than the ways in which we define refugees 70 plus years ago. So it is not just fear of religious persecution. It is a combination of factors: poverty, climate-induced displacement, rising sea levels, and even sometimes conflict that is generated because of desertification, gang violence, for example, or extrajudicial killings that occur. And so this is a very broad landscape. And so we really need to be thinking about what are our global commitments, not just to people of our nation state, but really across the globe. And many of these problems, particularly around climate, but also economic inequity, were generated by many who were from prosperous countries. So I do think it is owed to us to think about these issues in this more cosmopolitan frame, as you suggest, Arkan. I'd like to just briefly touch on the question you raised earlier, which was very provocative, that two people at Stop and Shop might feel that this may not be materially different. And I would argue differently. So if I was, let's say, Jose and Maria, I may be afraid to go to Stop and Shop because I might be afraid that I will be deported, right? If I were African American, I might feel afraid that the people who perpetrated racial violence on January 6th are operating with impunity. So I do think that even if our bank balance may not have changed in that sense of material difference, there may be a difference in the way we see ourselves and our place in this country.
Yes, excellent point. And then to tie the rights theme to the democracy theme and immigration, I guess I really agree that the immigration flows and people flows across borders will only increase for all of the reasons, John and Sushma, that you said. And unless we can figure out internationally how to deal with that situation in a more sensible way that protects rights, then democracy in these countries is going to be in a lot of trouble, because it is the responses, nativist responses to the people flows that in the United States, in France, in Germany with the AfD, in England, that has put an enormous amount of pressure on democracy, because we haven't developed the muscles in these societies to figure out how to deal with the much higher rates of immigration and flows inward. Before we leave this topic of Europe, I wanted to return to the question of Russia and Europe's interests. Much has been made that that the surprises from the Russian side may make this outcome the opposite of what Vladimir Putin had intended with the strengthening of NATO. What I want to ask John and Sushma is, in the long arc, do you think this will be good or bad for peace and democracy in Europe? Because much more quickly than many of us had anticipated, Germany turned on a dime. Finland and maybe Sweden will join our kind of pro-NATO. The countries of Europe are coalescing around NATO and a rearmed alliance because they're aware of the realism of the possibility of Russian and other kinds of military invasion. So the optimistic lens is that Europe is now awakened to the importance and the challenge of maintaining peace on the continent. That's an optimistic future. A more pessimistic future as well, whatever the outcome of the war in 6 months or 1 year's time, all of these countries are going to be rearmed, and they have very, very different ideologies and beliefs and politics. And that turns Europe into a much more dangerous place than just 2 months ago.
Well, I think there are risks, to be sure, in the policies that are being pursued right now. But in balance, I think they are policies that will help defend democracy, resist against the kind of coercion and violent coercion that Putin represents. And I think you're not seeing a mass rearming of the societies in Europe. The United States, of course, is already very heavily armed. We know that, and there are some issues that definitely need to be addressed in that regard. However, we're living in an extremely dangerous world, and I think arms for some degree of deterrence, a high degree of deterrence, are necessary. And arms in a coalition are very different from arms that are under kind of nationalist, even xenophobic interests that might be the case in the event that some of these populist right-wing governments were to come to power in addition to Orban. So I think in balance, it's a good development. I do think there are current short-term dangers. I think that the danger of escalation of the war is very much there. I think it's unlikely that the West is going to pursue escalation, but it obviously, by arming Ukraine, it does invite the potential for that, including obviously the danger of the use of nuclear tactical weapons. I think the question of a military solution over a diplomatic solution, which is at the moment seeming to be the predominant approach, is a little problematic. However, it's entirely up to the Ukrainians to determine when and how they might want to solve this war diplomatically. And I think finally, the long-term question of who's going to be in charge, particularly in the United States, in the event that Biden turns out to be a one-term president, and what happens after that, and what So there is a
Yes.
great deal of uncertainty about the future of this alliance, even though I think its current direction is entirely appropriate and is actually defending democracy.
Yeah, good, good.
So I would reply to that question with a slightly different answer, which is that I think we need to think about the role of civil society and social movements within countries in Europe, as well as regional and kind of, more global movements. Because the reality is, if we're talking about defending democracy, building resistance, building voices for change, then we really have to think about local leaders and the ways in which to strengthen the infrastructure for civil society in many countries where civil society is currently under attack. If we think of Hungary, if we think of Russia, and it's not just human rights groups. Of course, human rights groups are greatly at risk, but it's a broad swath of civil society institutions, including academic organizations. And so I think that is really, really important as we think about responses to have long-term capacity building for ensuring democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in right now, so much of the Ukraine-Russia story is a story of is the military story, and that's where the reporting is. That's where a bunch of the social media is. In retrospect, as time passes, I think more of the story will be a civil society story. To see the protests in these towns that are occupied by pretty brutal Russian forces, and ordinary people in the town yelling at these soldiers is just an incredible mark of bravery. And I think that we'll be paying more attention to that as in the fullness of time, I think. Good. And then the final topic before we move to the American, to the US context, how does the situation in Ukraine leave the idea of international human rights and international war crimes? In one way, we have seen war crimes the likes of which we haven't seen in Europe in quite some time, in a long time. And already there are investigations going on. But on the other hand, I know that the United States is not signatory to the Rome Accords or the ICC, and I believe Russia is not either. So does the current situation point to a reality in which those international accords and norms are just too slow and impotent, and the parties to them, the people that you need to be parties to them, just simply won't be? Or will it strengthen those international institutions going forward?
Well, I think to some extent it will strengthen them. I think that the need for the International Criminal Court, which even the U.S. has recognized from time to time, and even though it's not a member, it has raised issues and brought them before the International Criminal Court. I had a lot of experience with these issues of justice in the Balkans in the 1990s. And there we actually, there was no history whatsoever other than the Nuremberg trials that had taken place 4 decades earlier. And so what we did was to build a set of institutions, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and it was very slow, to be sure, but it created a massive record of war crimes and ultimately convicted a large number of people who were at high levels involved in committing them. Not enough, to be sure. I think the problem today is that with the UN in gridlock because of Russia having a seat on the Security Council and unwilling to authorize anything like a new tribunal, it's going to take UN reform, and that's almost an oxymoron, I think. And whoever would have thought the UN could reform itself, given its political makeup. So, but that's what it's going to take in order to get these issues of accountability and justice addressed. However, I want to go at a different level, and particularly building on what Sushma earlier said, which I completely agree with, the issues of civil society and the opportunities for civil society levels of accountability to be developed, and the record being created And the extraordinary work that the Ukrainians themselves are doing right now in compiling this information is very important. And I think the record, it's important in an era of disinformation and lying, that an accurate account of the atrocities and even genocide, which I said before, that are being committed in Ukraine is going to be done. And that will happen. I believe that is happening. Whether they can lead to some kind of trials at the international criminal level is another question.
That's an important point. All by itself, that widespread network of documentation and testimony and data collection, whether or not it articulates to these international justice institutions, is all by itself hugely significant. And so I think you're right, very right to point out that it would be a big, big mistake to say, oh, the war crimes question all hangs on whether or not these international bodies do their work. Those are important, but there are many other pieces as well that we should be attentive to. Absolutely. Pivoting a little to the United States, John, you wrote with our colleague Catherine Sickink an article in Foreign Policy that was about the U.S. practicing what it preaches abroad, but practicing it at home. So I think it's very easy to cheer I certainly am very much cheering on the Biden administration, as are many Democrats and Republicans alike. It's one of the few issues in our time in which there seems to be some bipartisan consensus, and that's about Russia and the invasion. But you and Catherine kind of turn it around and say, fine, it's easy to do that. Might be a little bit harder to walk the democracy and human rights walk at home. So what are the ways in which we need to do better at home?
Well, in all ways. We have, I mean, the biggest democracy crisis that all of us who are in the United States are facing right now is right here at home. And many of our democratic institutions are broken. We've seen gridlock. We have polarization. We have a massive amount of unfinished business that has been put before the Congress that the Biden administration is trying to pursue. So there's a great deal of work to be done, and the United States is both weakened from a national security standpoint and being able to promote soft power overseas if it has a democracy crisis at home. And it, above all, needs to be true to itself. And this is really what our book is about, because the book is about a search for the values that can hold the country together. And what are those values? Well, it turns out the values really are the values of human rights and responsibilities, very much parallel with that. That's what Catherine and I wrote in our article. Responsibilities to respect the rights of others. But in a country as diverse as the United States, unprecedented diversity, the thing that will hold it together is respect for rights. Now, in order to find out how Americans today feel about their rights, we did a great deal of polling. We did public opinion polling in several different dimensions. We did some at the very beginning of the pandemic, and then we did some just very recently last year. And remarkably and overwhelmingly, we found that Americans, at least at a very high level, have a very strong commitment to human rights at home, to their rights, and not only to their rights, but also to their responsibilities as citizens. One of the findings in our poll was that 80% of Americans across the political spectrum, including Republicans and independents as well as Democrats, said that without our rights, America is nothing. And Americans have more in common than many people think. Now, that was a surprise. We were surprised ourselves to get that result. And of course, this is at odds with the polarization that we see all around us. But when we dug down a little deeper in the polling, we found actually there are rays of possibility of bridging political divisions. For example, we found that a majority of Americans agree that civil rights should be balanced with civic responsibilities, as I mentioned before. 8 out of 10 Americans agree that personal freedom their personal freedom should be balanced against a responsibility to keep people safe in a pandemic. We asked very specifically the question basically about what you would do to make sure that the society at large could be kept safe. And most people agreed with the masking and the other approaches that were being taken. Not everybody, but certainly 8 out of 10. On a very different topic, 8 out of 10 Americans agree that the police can protect the public from crime while also being held accountable for violations of civil rights, a very important finding. 80% basically said that the police should be held accountable, even though they could do their jobs while being held accountable. So I think we found that a majority of Americans really reject the culture wars that are being fought at the political extremes because they don't live at the extremes. They live across the broad political center. 72% agreed that they're fed up with polarization, that politicians are intentionally dividing our country, and that they should work together to find solutions to the country's problems. So, you know, in the bottom line here is that we found a remarkable degree, not only of agreement about rights in general, but agreement about particular rights. And about 70 to 80% of the country, at least at a very high level, have that kind of commitment. So there is what I would call a silent majority of Americans, using a phrase that was popular back in the era of Richard Nixon, but I think it's true again today, a silent majority that supports an expansive view of rights and responsibilities. And then a very activist, a much more active than the silent minority, that is working to prevent the country from coming together. And this is, to be rather specific about it, based on our polling, this is an active minority made up of mostly white constituency motivated by fear. A fear that, and they deny the rights of others that they regard as threats to their racial, cultural, or political dominance. And so we have this is true, of course, in the countries we were talking about, some of them in Europe as well. So this is not unique to the United States. And this is a deep underlying concern and condition as demography changes. However, 70% or 80% as part of this silent majority strongly support racial equality, equal rights, equal justice. And I think it's important to recognize that. So that's what our book found and what we put before the readers. And I think it's important. We're not unrealistic about this. We don't suggest that this is immediately going to transform the country, but we have found the values that are the values that could hold the country together.
That's excellent. So there's two, I love the book and I commend it to everyone who's listening or watching. There are two big surprises in the book to me. One of the big surprises is that there's much more agreement that you found than disagreement across these party lines. There's large agreement about the importance of the right to vote, the importance of free speech, the importance of racial equality, even the importance of equal opportunity. And there's also large bipartisan agreement on a large number of rights that aren't in the Constitution, that are expansive and aspirational rights, like having clean air and clean water, high quality education, affordable healthcare, protection of personal data, even having a job, right? So one big surprise is that there's so much agreement. And another surprise is that rights, you think, can be a starting point to bring us together when we ordinarily sometimes think of rights as being something that drives us apart, because the rights that you think are important are quite different from the rights that I think are important oftentimes, right? And so there's been a very recent news event. Probably a lot of people in the audience looked at the Politico leak about Samuel Alito, Justice Alito's draft opinion on abortion that would overturn Roe v. Wade if it turns out to be the court's ruling. Maybe this is a question for either John or Sushma, but maybe Sushma, if you could open up, what do you think about the Supreme Court's decision that seems certainly by the period from Roe to yesterday, basically, quite different from the constitutional law as it stood, and then also maybe quite different from public opinion?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that this has been, in the works for a while. You touched on January 6th. We touched on the prior administration. So this is shocking, but also not surprising. And it also connects to a range of other rights. So, we don't lead single issue lives. Somebody today on Twitter posted who was whose son actually was killed in a school shooting, that, if people were actually concerned about the lives of children, they would really think about how to, get rid of gun violence. But we've not been able to tackle the issue of gun violence in a meaningful way. Similarly, if you look at the history of, the ways in which women's bodies have been controlled, we've had forced sterilizations, for example, in the past. We've had a history of enslavement that really has, degraded African American women's bodies. So I think that this is really, a shocking development, but I'm also hopeful that this could result in people galvanizing to say that, reproductive rights and justice are important to a good society.
I just want a footnote to Sushma's comment, which I agree with. What we found in our poll is, again, both hopeful and a bit surprising. 72% of Americans, bipartisan across the board, including 55% of Republicans, so more than a majority of Republicans, support a woman's right to make decisions about her body and her personal life. And that's very fundamental. So if 72% of Americans are of that point of view, the Supreme Court is completely out of touch with the reality, to say nothing of the fact that it's in the process of overturning a half a century of law, and highly disruptive and certainly deeply damaging to people of limited means and people of color who are going to be searching in vain for ways of exercising what 72% of Americans think is a constitutional right.
And so we often think of the court, or in past decades have thought of the court as the protector of rights. It kind of, your survey results leave me with this puzzle that so many Americans agree on the importance of many of these priorities. That's number one. Number two is they feel like these priorities are not secure, from free speech to voting to racial equality to certainly to quality education and clean air and water. They're afraid that they might not be able to enjoy these things. And yet none of the branches of politics, of our political institutions, seem on board with these very high measures that of what people want. So what's the problem?
Well, we have just a quick word, and then I want Sushma to respond as well. I think we have some real structural issues here, and they ought to be put on the table. We have a dysfunctional U.S. Senate, and the Senate is dysfunctional in fundamental ways because it can't operate as a majority institution, which most legislative bodies do. So it can't reflect the view of the people because there are filibuster opportunities. We have a Supreme Court with lifetime appointments, which we've had for a long time now. But it turns out, I think, that what happens, particularly as people go onto the court, is that you really need to have some refreshment that brings new people on. Now, of course, what's happened recently is a variety of new people have come on the court who passed a very specific litmus test to the president who nominated them, which is whether they would overturn Roe versus Wade. And so there are plenty of examples, I think, of the politicization of the courts. So these institutional structural questions are very much part of the disconnect between public opinion on the one hand, which is favorable to rights, and the public policies that are emerging.
Great. Sushma, you look like you're about to add.
So I would just add to say that, rights is secured through hard work, through collective mobilization, through putting pressure on institutions that often will reflect the perspectives of the powerful. And, the law just does not always equal justice. There have been Supreme Court decisions that frankly were ones that we look back in history and say they were the wrong ones. The fight to end slavery, the fight for women's emancipation, all of these involved the mobilization of people on the ground to demand changes for the better, for more inclusiveness. And I think this could be a moment where we see more people coming together to try and advocate for such changes.
Yeah, it's actually worth reading the draft opinion for people who haven't. A big part of it deals with other reversals. So Justice Alito says, we were wrong in Plessy v. Ferguson. We were wrong in Lochner and knocking down the minimum wage. So we were wrong in Roe too. So let's change that. Anyhow, it's interesting turns of reasons there. I want to go now to some specific rights, and you look at many rights, and the book deals with a large scope, which is one of its real virtues, one of its many real virtues. But if you were to nominate one or two rights, maybe I'll give each of you an opportunity to nominate one that you think is particularly important to turn the ship around, in which large majorities have these priorities, but the political institutions, our democracy is not delivering. What is the right, a right that you'd urge Americans to really focus on and try to vindicate at this point so that we can start to turn things around? John, and then Sushma.
I think voting rights would be at the top of my list, and indeed, it's not by accident that they're the first topic that's taken up in the book, and they are the area where there has been the hottest contention in the country over the future of democracy. After all, and as I said earlier, we had for a while we had a president who was following what I would call the insurrectionist model of democracy, which is, if you win the vote, that's fine, and then you go ahead and govern. If you lose the vote, you don't accept the result, and you certainly don't have a peaceful transfer of power. And that is the most dangerous thing for any democracy to have that. So I think voting rights, and very specifically efforts to stop voter suppression, to adopt national standards for voting, so that you can't have this potpourri of different standards, even though I realize that that's going to be challenging in terms of the tradition of state-oriented voting. And it's true that the Constitution does give states an opportunity to set rules, but we need national rules. And 87% of the people in our poll said that they want national standards for voting. So we're dealing with a public that's very restless and restive for this. I think we need to simplify the voting process. And indeed, my colleague Miles Rappaport and E.J. Dion, with whom I've done a number of events like this, have argued that we ought to have universal mandatory voting. I'm not sure I would go that far, but I think we should have universal registration, universal opportunity, and make it simpler and easier for people to vote. And then finally, we need some of the structural reforms, particularly in the Senate that I mentioned before. So that would be my nomination. But I have another one, but I have a feeling Sushma's going to make the same one. So a different one. I know what she's going to do, I hope.
Great.
We have not coordinated on this,
No,
so
we haven't.
I'm not sure what your second one was, John. But since you said voting rights, which was on the top of my list, I will just say more broadly, racial justice, civil rights is really important. I think that actually connects to a range of other rights that we are talking about, or maybe haven't even touched on. In the opening foreword written by Martha Minow, she starts by saying that rights are both ideals and measures of the shortfall of human societies. And I think if we think of the historical legacy of enslavement in this country and the lingering disparities and the effects of discrimination on people of color more generally, but African Americans and Native Americans more specifically, I do think we need to address these issues. And it's no surprise that actually we are seeing forces that are really not wanting us to study this history in schools, or wanting to revise textbooks or muzzle the capacity of libraries. So I would prioritize that issue. And I think that would then also improve other access to other rights as well.
Excellent, excellent.
Well, I would also
yeah.
just add that the polling data is very good on that subject. Believe it or not, even something as specific as we need more legislation and strengthening of non-discrimination in housing and employment. And there we have about, I'm just checking the numbers, but I think it's quite high. We have 81% of our respondents, including 64% of Republicans, agree that the laws against racial discrimination in those areas should be strengthened.
Excellent. I wanted to raise a third area of rights that beyond, or that's different from either voting or racial equality and inclusion. And that is, and you talk about this in your book quite a bit, is free expression and free speech. The media environment in the whole world has changed quite dramatically in the last 15 years or so, with the rise of social media, and in the United States, the decline of traditional professional media and journalism. We have just this last week, probably the world's richest person, Elon Musk, buying one of the most influential social media platforms, Twitter. How does the free speech environment, or the speech and information environment, affect the realization of rights in your view?
Enormously, obviously, the whole question of truth, and there's going to be a conference about this tomorrow that our co-author Matthias Risa is hosting at the Carr Center. I mean, how can you have a search for truth in a digital world in which there is constant opportunity for disinformation? And in the earlier days of the media, of course, or in the heyday of the media in the United States, there was a kind of gatekeeping function of reporting and people who are journalists who were exercising that. Now, basically, everything is open. So what we have is a social media environment in which disinformation is constantly pervaded and can be very widely disseminated. So that, I think, is a problematic issue to address, but it needs to be addressed. And there are ways of doing that, which we could get into, but Sushma may want to add to that.
Yeah, so there are three things I'd like to say about Elon Musk and Twitter. The first is, irrespective of who he is, the fact that you have billionaires controlling all of these large social media platforms, which are no longer purely for entertainment, right? They're for communications, they're for accessing news, they're for building political campaigns. They form a large part of our public sphere. And so that is just one concern, that you have yet another billionaire controlling the space. The second issue was, he had posted on Twitter where he clarified that by free speech, he simply means that which matches the law. He says that he's against censorship that goes far beyond the law. And if that people want less free speech, they will ask government to pass laws to that effect. Therefore, going beyond the law is contrary to the will of the people. So this struck me as particularly naive, If you think of our conversation where we were talking about Russia and Poland and Hungary earlier, but even in the United States, if we are relying on governments to pass laws as to what is permissible, then we will find very quickly that in many countries around the world, it will be censorship, right? You cannot criticize the ruling party or the person in power. And then on the flip side, what he will permit really is hate speech that will not be moderated. And this really has a significant impact on women, on people of color, on ethnic minorities, where I think the past kind of interventions that Twitter had in terms of taking down posts and trying to perform some sort of content moderation, albeit after the fact, I think some of those protections may be affected. And so I do think this raises some questions and alarm bells, but the reality is also that there aren't other platforms right now like Twitter. And how do we think of maintaining these global platforms for communication and connection that also foster civility, respect, and regard for human rights?
Great, thank you. So one of the questions from James in the Q&A is just a definitional question, which I think is important. It says it would be helpful to define better what it means to be a liberal democracy. And we talked about Hungary and illiberal democracy in the first part of the hour. It's a long conversation, but simply put, the liberal democracy is those two pieces where democracy people think of oftentimes as majority rule. If enough people want something to happen, then in a democracy, it happens, not in our democracy, but in the ideal. Whereas liberalism in the modern context is about the protection of individual rights and liberties and freedoms. And so even if a democracy votes that Japanese Americans should have to go to concentration camps, that would be a violation of liberalism, of their rights. And so democracy is not the same thing as rights, as individual rights and freedoms. And the idea of liberal democracy is to put those two pieces together, right? So that's a short answer to James's question. And then a couple of folks in the Q&A are bringing up the very important challenge that Sushma already pointed to, of money, of billionaires and democracy. And you guys talk about that in your book. And in the extreme, who was it? Was it Brandeis? Brandeis that said you can have great concentrations of wealth or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. And so right now in the United States, we certainly have great concentrations of wealth. So where does that leave us with the question of hijacking of democracy?
Well, I think that there's a very direct connection in many ways between the growing economic inequality, which is now greater than it's ever been at any other point in American history, and the sidetracking or hijacking, as we say in the book, of rights, because it's possible in a system where there is unlimited economic power that can be exercised by individuals, it's possible without regulation for people essentially to buy their way into various policies that they'd prefer to have. And so we do have a growing interest, I think, in a regulatory system to guard against that, certainly in the use of money in politics. We also have what I think is a growing potential far left, far right, or not even far left, but basically across the political spectrum, coalition of people who are very eager to see a change in the way in which we manage wealth in this country, a way in which the government might address issues of economic inequality. We see this in our poll. In the polls we saw during the pandemic in particular, the interest in what we call economic rights, the right to education, the right to housing, the right to clean air and water, et cetera, the interest in those rights grew substantially, and the expectation that government could do something about them grew substantially. So we have a chapter in our book called Freedom from Want, which is to pick a phrase that Roosevelt used in the 1930s, in which we talk about this issue of the danger of concentrations of wealth into rights in exercised by the public at large. So it's very much of there is a direct connection, I think, and this is an issue that more people would like to see addressed now.
So in terms of inequality in the US, absolutely, I think this is a huge issue, and it really touches on many of the other issues we've been talking about. And inequality is actually rising in the US, and it's also higher than in other advanced economies. If we look at the comparison of income inequality, looking at the Gini coefficient, which is basically a number that measures inequality, the US is actually higher than other G7 countries. It's similar in a way to India. So I think this is a source of concern. And in addition to income inequality, we also have to think about wealth inequality, which is like the assets that people have and the wealth divide that takes place. And then the one thing I'll flag that connects to the racial justice conversation is the suggestion for reparations, which has been kind of, coming up from time to time. And I do think that is an important conversation to center in this discussion of wealth and income inequality as to how do we deal with like historical legacies of discrimination in order to ensure that institutions are better equipped to deal with these challenges in the future, and that people are sort of compensated for, past discrimination and exclusion.
Yeah, it is hard to know what to do about the wealth situation. So, one school of thought says we should build bigger walls between the economic domain where there's big inequality and the political domain where there's supposed to be political equality, one person, one vote. And other people say, well, that will never work because money is like water. This is called the hydraulic theory of money and politics. It's like water, and any dam that you build, money will find a way to penetrate through. So the only thing you can really do is to level out those inequalities of the great concentrations of wealth in the background there. Perhaps we can end up with some suggestions about how to move forward. And so a couple of areas on how to move forward. One is, how are we doing on rights education, on people knowing, Americans understanding the rights and responsibilities that they have in civic education? So that's a broad-based one that I'd like to ask you to address. And the second is directly on the hijacking of democracy. Is there anything we can do to assure that January 6th won't play out in a more devastating way in 2024 or 2028? So
well, let me take the second one first. And I have a very straightforward, perhaps too much of a lawyer's and a civil liberties lawyer's perspective on that, which is, I think, the most effective and important way, and I'm nervous that it may not be pursued, that we can make sure that it's made very clear that what happened at the insurrection in the Capitol was not only a violation of the norms of democracy, but a violation of the law. And I think we have prosecutions that are underway of people who participated in the insurrection, but I think those prosecutions need to go all the way up to the top. And I think the only way to make this a clear statement by a democratic system that believes in the rule of law and that is able to protect itself against insurrection is to prosecute those who sought violently to overthrow the government of the United States. And so that's my answer to that. There are a lot of technical things that could be done, but and I think the forthcoming report of the January 6th committee of the House of Representatives will address this question. And then it, of course, will be before the Justice Department and the Attorney General to make decisions.
very good. Sushma, final word?
Yeah, so I completely agree with John on the issue of prosecutions. I think that is really, really critical for not only for January 6th, but also for the future to show that impunity is not the path. In terms of civic education, I think that's really important. We've touched on these topics before, but I'd also touch civic education in the digital age. We have young people getting online at very young ages, getting on social media, often getting their news through social media. So really thinking about how does one discern what is the truth, what is fake news, how do you not amplify information that is misinformation or disinformation, how do you communicate with others in civil and respectful ways and negotiate differences of perspective respectfully. All of these are really, really critical skills that need to be invested in. The question is, what is the business model for this, given the underfunding of public education? Again, we do not want billionaire philanthropists in the space necessarily controlling this dialogue, but we need to really think about, how do we build a collective and common public sphere that is, characterized by pluralism and respect for rights and tolerance.
Yeah, on the social media civic education, my understanding is that the place in the world to look for the cutting edge of this is in Estonia and Finland, because they've been subject to so much Russian and so there are lots of practices and experimentations and innovations in how to educate both young people, but everyone in the populace about how to inoculate themselves from this kind of misinformation to kind of bring it back. So where we kind of come around full circle, and as Mary opened with, we are at unprecedented moments, a time of polarization, but then also inequality at record levels, even surpassing the Gilded Age in the United States, of pandemic and war. All of these storms that were unimaginable just 5 or 6 years ago. And Sushma and John have done a great service to us all of bringing a discussion of rights as the foundation of a basis for how to move forward that brings us together, both in terms of what we want to achieve in the world and what's important, but then also about how to use rights as a way to strengthen solidarity and democracy. So it's a wonderful book. And I want to thank Mary and the Cambridge Forum and Sushma and John and everyone in the audience for just a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. And back to you, Mary.
Well, thank you. That was a really good discussion. I mean, we covered a lot of ground, but yeah, much more to be enjoyed in the book in depth. Okay, so I'd like to thank today's guests, John Shattuck, Sushma Raman, and Arkon Fung for such a good job. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Dorothy and Herbert Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, the Cambridge Community Foundation, and you. If you'd like to donate or sign up to our members list, visit our website, www.cambridgeforum.org. There you will find a podcast of this program shortly and many others, as well as video links to the programs that we've made in the past and also podcasts. Each week we produce NPR broadcasts of our forums, and a video of this will be up on YouTube shortly. And thank you all for taking part today. We had an enormous number of people listening and watching, and we're grateful to you for taking part.